Hello, everyone. This is episode 20 of the Brandon Adams podcast. I have with me Maria Konnikova. She is the author of The Confidence Game, The Biggest Bluff, which is coming out quite soon, and a book that I have just ordered, Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. That one sounds interesting. You'll have to tell me about that a bit later. She's a contributing writer for The New Yorker, and she hopefully is going to continue as a professional poker player.
Yes, we'll see what the world has to say about that.
You wrote the book, you finished it quite a while ago, the way books go. There's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross. You've dotted all the I's and you've crossed all the T's, and now it's time to promote. How does it seem in your own mind? Was this a long process? Where are we?
It was a very long process, and a process that I never could have foreseen. It was one of these things where I conceived of the project back in 2016, and it was supposed to be, a one-year thing where I team up with Erik Seidel. He teaches me, I play the main event of the World Series, and we have a book. And obviously none of that happened other than the fact that I worked with Erik Seidel. That was the only part of the plan that actually was the same as my initial plan for the book. And it ended up just going in an entirely different direction. I never could have foreseen how the journey would go. The fact that I would fall in love with this game and actually show some sort of aptitude in it. I never considered going pro. If you had told me, Maria, in a few years, you're going to be a professional poker player. You're going to be a member of PokerStars Team Pro. You're going to be doing all of these things. I would have said, ha, 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 ha. Because it's really not anything I was ever interested in. Excuse the sirens. We're in the middle of New York here. It became a very, very different book. Luckily, I have an amazing editor who just let me do my own thing and said, if the book's a few years delayed, that's fine. Nobody's going to scoop you. It's your own story, right? It's a memoir. It's not like someone's going to write a book about this before you do. So because it wasn't a newsy subject, it was something that I could do anytime I wanted. But of course, it's funny. No one expects to be releasing a book in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of social protests, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. I mean, that is something that I also could have never predicted. And in a way, the book is actually quite relevant because one of the main themes is chance and learning to deal with the things that we can't predict, with uncertainty, with the things we can't control. That was the inspiration for the book. But on the other hand, it feels kind of pointless. Like, what am I doing promoting a book right now?
I have a lot to say on these topics. I want to hold off a little bit. If we will, I want to hold off on those a little bit. And there are upsides to launching during a pandemic.
Such as
people have more time, right?
This is true.
And I've been reading a lot more during the pandemic, and you probably know Emily St. John Mandel.
Yep.
Seems like a good time for her to launch The Glass Hotel, right? Her previous book was about a pandemic.
It was, yes.
And
it was great. Everyone should go read not Ocean's 11. Oh my God, Station 11. In my head, I've got all these things, but Station 11 was a wonderful book. So is The Glass Hotel. Emily is an amazing writer.
Yeah, I loved both of those books, and I would never have discovered them absent the pandemic. Oh. Obviously, Station 11 got a lot of press.
It did, yes.
Pandemic, and I discovered it and I read it and was like, wow. And then got The Glass Hotel and like that maybe even more. So.
And no one's sick in The Glass Hotel.
Yes. And The Glass Hotel, well, we won't get into it, but it tracks the Madoff scandal pretty well. Mm-hmm. So I want to, first of all, so what happened was you came in poker for a year, and then everyone in poker gave you a big bear hug and said, wait a minute, you're interested in poker? Come join us for a while. And Poker Stars gave you a bear hug, and Seidel and everyone who Seidel introduced you to. So they gave you this big bear hug and they wouldn't let you go. And then
Good way of looking at it.
After 3 years, you said, all right, I have to leave you guys and go actually do this thing. Maybe that's what happened until, so there is a poker literature, and I would say, well, there were some very, very early examples of your genre. I guess Alvarez would be the closest comparison because he has a strong literary background. But then Jim McManus had a lot of commercial success with Positively Fifth Street. He seemed to sell a lot of copies of that book. I mean, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time. I'm sure you probably had it in the proposal somewhere. Do you happen to recall, like, has that book sold more than any other poker book?
I actually have no idea. I never saw the sales figures. It was a great book. I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed Alvarez. You know, I have over here, you can't see it, it's out of the shot, but I have 2 shelves of poker books that I read for
oh, nice.
For
some of your favorites.
You know, I really I'm a big fan of the more literary ones. I mean, I did love Alvarez. I loved Positively Fifth Street. I'm looking right now. There's a great older one called Memoir of a Gambler that someone recommended to me. That was pretty great. Right now I'm just looking at not strategy books. We're not talking about those, but just kind of the other types of books. So I think those were the ones that really struck me. Big Deal, Anthony Holden. That was a good one. Big Deal is
a great one. I was going to mention that.
Yeah, that was a good one. I mean, Professor Banker, Suicide King is very different, but it's also a very fun book.
I have one. I wrote.
What's that?
It's called Broke, a poker novel, in 2005, I think.
That's great.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I have to read it.
Jessie May's Shut Up and Deal is really good.
I haven't read that one.
I would strongly recommend that one.
Okay. And I read a lot of strategy books.
A lot of strategy books. And what were your favorites in that?
Well, honestly, it depends on the stage of my development, right? So at the beginning, Erik had me buy all of the Harrington on Hold'em books, which was huge. I mean, that was kind of the foundational stuff that I read. That was the first poker strategy I was exposed to. And then the great thing is I got a chance to actually meet Dan Harrington and talk through all of that with him. And I love him. He's such a great character, such a great guy, just this brilliant mind, and had so many fascinating insights about life, about the world, about gambling, just about how everything works. So those were the books that really helped me at the beginning. And then there were other books afterwards that really kind of were important. Like Matthew Jonda became like the book that I carried around with me for a very long time to try to, as I got more advanced in my play, both of his books. And that was great. Then I think that you were involved with this one. Let me see. This one's actually on my desk because it was the last one I read.
Yeah, that's a great book. That's a great book. That might be the best book out there right now.
Yep. So I've tried to keep current.
Okay, so let's jump into the timing.
Yeah.
You said you feel a little bit uneasy about the timing.
I do.
Why?
It feels strange to be talking about myself, to be talking about a book when so many other things are happening in the world that are just so pressing and so important. Who wants to read about poker when people are dying, and people are dying from a disease, people are dying in the streets because of police brutality, all of these things happening at once. It puts a lot of things in perspective. I do recognize that there are a lot of these themes in the book, and that I think it could actually I think that some of the things that I learned and that I try to kind of talk about in the book can help people deal with these sorts of things, but it still feels very small in comparison to what's going on.
So let me talk about the book, because you sent me an early copy. I was super excited to get it. I read it very quickly. I would say it's so smooth, and obviously I have a personal interest, and I know all of the characters. I think I started reading it at like 11:30 at night when I was really tired, and I read like 2/3 of it. And then I finished the remaining third in the morning. It was very smooth and very, very good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Everyone will love it. The broad audience will love it. But for a poker crowd, it can be tough because they're so familiar. Mm-hmm. And you strike the tone just right. Like, it's very, very smooth. It will be very popular. So I read it, and your tone is a little bit apologetic about poker, about poker culture. Not in a bad way, but like, you recognize the absurdity of some aspects of the culture. And it really works, because it is you, it is your, and by the same token, I was a little surprised by that tone. And one thing that's interesting from my personal perspective is I've been around poker for a long time, almost as long as Erik. And I've always recognized the absurdity of it, right? Like, from the clash with just playing poker for large amounts of money, and then at times when, say, climate change is becoming more important, where you're reading books about it, and then you're flying to Bahamas to play in a poker tournament. Like, I've always recognized the absurdity of it, but I basically reconciled it in my own mind, and it is seeming like we're getting to a historical time where it's becoming a little bit more challenging, the poker culture. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the next 5 years, because one thing that happened with the story of poker is that I can't explain why this happened, right? But you went from the mid 2000s, which was a boom time in the economy, and also a boom time in poker after Chris Moneymaker won the main event in 2003. From, say, 2003 to 2007, you had this huge poker cultural boom going on at the same time as an economic boom. But mostly the way that it manifested itself was strictly in terms of bigger numbers, not in terms of bigger game sizes. Mm-hmm. So you just had, like, the main event, which had been a $10,000 buy-in from its inception, was still a $10,000 buy-in, and you just had bigger numbers. $25,000 tournaments were basically unheard of. You had a handful. $100,000 tournaments, never, except for just TV shenanigans. You basically just had $10,000 tournaments, but your numbers were far bigger, and you didn't have more of them. It's just all of them were much bigger. And the game sizes were, they notched up from where they had been, but they didn't go into the stratosphere. And then something happened, like 2008 onward, where you started getting these bigger tournaments. And now we're still in that world of, like, very big buy-in tournaments where people maybe are selling action, but the stated buy-in is very high. And it just seems like maybe it's reached a point of absurdity where you have, on the one hand, really big buy-in tournaments and then what's going on in the economy. It seems too much of a disconnect.
Yes. I'm nodding my head. No, I mean, it is absurd in some regards. And I do think that it's not just poker. I think a lot of things are absurd if you start looking at them in that light. I do think poker has value inherently. That's one of the reasons that I wrote this book, as a teaching tool, as a way of helping your mind understand things that are really important to understand and think more clearly, think better, be a better decision maker outside of poker, which I think will help make the world a better place if people are more rational, if people understand statistics, if people understand probabilities, if people understand emotional management, if people have the tools for mental framing and resilience that will, make them able to see the world in a much more productive light. If we learn to tell the difference between, how we play the hand and what the outcome of the hand is, what we are controlling, and then the noise, the variance that's going to happen. These are all tools that I learned from poker, even though I have a PhD in psychology and I studied decision-making. I studied risky decision-making. And, I studied self-control. I worked with Walter Mischel, who's famous for the marshmallow studies of delayed gratification with the little kids who wait to eat the marshmallow or don't. And the number of minutes that they wait when they're 3-4 years old predicts all sorts of stuff as they get older. So I've known all of this stuff theoretically. It wasn't until I started playing poker that I was actually able to correct a lot of the biases that I otherwise was perfectly aware of, but didn't have the tools to conquer. And it's interesting, at the start of this, it wasn't quite the start, but I think it was in May, when kind of COVID, all the lockdowns were happening. I interviewed Danny Kahneman for The New Yorker, and we had a very interesting conversation. And Kahneman obviously is, his whole life has been studying these decision biases, the problems the brain has when it comes to probabilistic thinking. That's what he won a Nobel Prize for. I think the only psychologist to have ever won the Nobel Prize in economics. And, this is something that he's devoted his entire life to. And there was this really fascinating moment in our conversation where he acknowledged that he actually almost got on a plane to France after the pandemic had started because he couldn't wrap his mind around exponential growth. Theoretically, he had all of the tools for it. He knew all of these biases, but when it came to actually wrapping his brain around it, he couldn't. And the numbers seemed small and it seemed manageable and it seemed pretty safe. So he said, yeah, I'll go on this trip. And then he realized, wait, this is how it starts. Exponential growth means it starts very small, but suddenly we're going to have huge numbers. But the fact that he still struggles with that, even today, was very telling. And I think that that's a very common problem. And actually, some of the first people I saw who actually grasped this, knew how to think about it clearly, and raised alarms very early on were poker players, because they were people who actually understood how this works and sensed it intuitively because they had this tool to help them learn what it feels like, what these percentages feel like, what all of these things feel like. That's how the brain learns. That's why we're so bad at probabilities, because normally we don't have that experience. Normally our experiences are lopsided, skewed. We don't get to sample over and over and over. And so I think that for that, poker is actually incredibly relevant and will always stay relevant, because these are ways of seeing the world that enable you to see problems, that enable you to figure out how do we solve these problems. So in that sense, I actually think it's a very powerful game. But obviously, when you're talking about $1 million buy-in tournaments, then we're talking about something else. Then you all of a sudden do have a lot of these disconnects. I think that it's the same way that there's any profession that's not immediately useful. I'm a writer and a poker player, but I've been a writer my whole life. And I've had these moments of saying, like, what am I even doing? You know, I'm writing, I'm not actually doing anything or changing anything. My sister's a doctor. You know, my sister is a neonatologist. She's literally saving lives every single day. There are humans alive today who would have been dead without her. And it kind of puts it in perspective. And there's no way to say that her career doesn't matter. But for a lot of careers and a lot of life choices, you could say, well, how am I really helping?
When you got into poker in 2016, or you had familiarity with poker before 2016, but when you...
Not really.
When you get in 2016, it's a bit of an anthropology project along with a study of the decision making, and you do learn a lot about decision making, but you're also observing something, and it's clear that you understand this from the book. But what you're observing is this is a fierce competitive process that has been operating since 2003.
Yes.
So it's sort of like if you go to the US Open, watch tennis. It's remarkable that people maintain under pressure incredibly well.
Yes.
They've got 10,000 people in the stands watching them. And even if it's their first time playing in the stadium, a lot of times they're playing great, right? They've got match point, whatever, they play great. And it seems remarkable because 99% of the people, if they're playing tennis or they're playing golf or whatever under such a situation, they're going to choke under the pressure.
Yep.
But there's been a selection mechanism in play for a long time. And the people who are playing at the US Open, they don't choke.
Yep.
In poker, entering into it in 2016, you're entering into an environment where a selection mechanism has been in play for a long time. And the types of people who have survived, it's a strange group, right? it's a strange group. And part of it is that, well, you could go as far as to say that it's a strange group in terms of emotional construction, in terms of the way that the minds are actually constructed. Like, whatever the way that most poker players process information is minimum like 5% on the Asperger's spectrum, minimum. And then it just kind of goes up from there. But they process information in a very logical, rational, dry way. And it's not normal in the sense that, like, bluffing or responding to bluffing is not emotional and not unnatural in any way.
Right. For the best players, I think we need to caveat that. As you get on lower levels, it becomes different.
And then the separation of decision making from results also becomes second nature.
Yeah.
Which is, I found so entertaining the bad beat story, and where Erik was telling you, like, about the maybe you might go into that, but it's a funny thing because one of the ways that poker players process, well, they learn to distinguish between decision making and results is there's a time for retrospectives and there's a time not for retrospectives, and so I think the social banishment of bad beat stories has a lot to do with the fact that, okay, we're in a new space of going forward here. Let's not tread back, but maybe you could explain the concept and the culture of the bad beat story.
Sure. So a bad beat story is a story about how you should have won, but you didn't. So basically you're a favorite and then you suffer a bad beat. one of the classic ones is, if you have aces and you get it all in against kings and someone hits a king and suddenly they knock you out. Well, that's a bad beat because your aces should win there, a good amount of the time, around 75% of the time, right? But sometimes they won't. And a lot of people will then, run off and say, I can't believe it. I can't believe this happened. My aces got cracked, whatever it is, and tell this bad beat story. And you hear a lot of bad beat stories. And the first time I really realized how bad that was, and that it's really not something I should do, was very early on in my poker career. I was playing a tournament and I flopped a set. So I hit my miracle card on the flop, and I thought that this was going to be great, and I was going to have my first big tournament cash. And I got called by a draw, and the draw completed, and I was knocked out of the tournament, and I was very upset. And Erik at the time was playing one of these high roller events that you've referred to. I think it was a 25K, it might have been a 50K at the Aria. So I walked over, and he was on a break, and I started talking to him, and I started telling him this hand, and he just stops me. And I was like, but I'm not even done with the hand. And he says, do you have a question about the hand? And I was like, well, no, I had a set. And he's like, that's it. I don't want to hear anything else. He's like, you were a favorite when the money went in, and I don't care. I don't care how the hand ends. And he told me a phrase that has really just stuck with me, which is telling a bad beat story is like putting your trash on someone else's lawn. And it's such a good way of looking at it. But I actually think it goes a step further, because what I realized, so he made me promise right then and there that I was never going to tell him about a hand unless I had a question about it, that I was basically never allowed to tell bad beat stories, no exceptions. And sometimes it was really difficult because I really wanted to tell that bad beat story, but it's such a great habit, because one of the other things he said, one of the main ways we've worked together is going through hands. I'll talk through a hand with him. He'll talk through a hand he's played. We'll discuss hands that other people have played and just go through the decision process, go through the analysis, try to figure out, what's going on. And he actually told me, I never care how the hand ends. I don't want you to tell me. I don't care about the outcome. We don't need to know that. We don't need to know what the other person had or any of this stuff, unless we're analyzing that specific player and trying to figure out how the player plays. Then it matters what they had, obviously. But normally, the outcome doesn't matter. Just focus on the process. So I don't care if you won or lost. I care about the decision nodes, where you were thinking about it. And it's such a powerful way of reframing things and thinking, because I realized that telling a bad beat story isn't just putting your trash on someone else's lawn. The fact that you retain the bad beat, you have that trash inside you. It's actually poisoning you. It's bad. It's noxious. And if your mindset shifts to, okay, I just care about the process, not what ended up happening, it's this really empowering thing, because you can fix the process. You can focus on what you did wrong. You can focus on your decision making. You can focus on your reactions. You can't focus on the outcome. And over time, I actually found that I stopped remembering. Like, my mind actually, that trash never stayed. It just went straight out. I actually don't remember most bad beats. I don't remember how I busted a lot of tournaments. Like, I'll be out of the tournament and 2 hours later, I don't remember the hand, unless it was an interesting hand. If it was an interesting hand, then I definitely remember it because there were decision processes. But if I got, a set in and someone else ended up getting a flush, fine. It happens. I don't remember. I'll forget it. It's not even in my mind. And I think that helps you grow. It helps you be much more positive. It helps you be much more resilient, and it helps you think a lot better because you're not carrying all of this around.
I think one of the best thinkers in poker has been young Tom Dwan.
I don't know him. He's one of the ones that I never met.
He did really teach a lot of, he was an early star, but also taught a lot of the early stars. And he he was very good at separating process from results, but also very good about continuously questioning his own play. And about being straightforward where I was thinking this at the time and I made a mistake. Like being very open to making mistakes. And in my process, in my development, I think going over hands with other players is valuable to a point, but there are also certain dangers in it. So I try to teach people to recognize that there is a cost as well as a benefit to going over hands, especially if you're in a habit of going over hands. The one of the dangers is that you then don't experiment enough, because you know that if you do something that is mistaken, you'll be going over it later. So you feel the need to defend your plays as you're making them, which can have a cost. So because Erik is the main character in your story, I want to talk about Erik for a little bit. So decision making under stress and uncertainty. This is what poker is teaching you. To a certain extent, if you're a longtime poker player, you're like a cortisol manager. You know, you've got cortisol going through your brain, doing its thing, and you have to manage it in the short term, making sure that it's not impacting your short-term decision-making uncertainty. And you have to manage it over the long term, like making sure, okay, I'm staying healthy despite the fact that I'm playing this game where a lot of artificial stress is created. And then if you're at a tournament event, you have to say, okay, my schedule is that I'm playing these 5 tournaments. If event 1 doesn't go well, I don't want it affecting the other events. And Erik is, well, we don't know. He's very calm in a hand. We assume that the short-term cortisol management is good, but it's also in the long term, he's the best, maybe. Like he is a calm, collected guy.
Yeah.
Over a long period of time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I can't understate how lucky I am that Erik is the person I ended up working with. I had no idea what I was doing. Like, let's be clear. Sure, I had, he was the first person I approached, and there was a reason I chose him. I'd looked at, the longevity, a lot of these things that you've just talked about and that I write about in the book. I didn't really know that was going to be the case, that he was someone who was so calm and collected. He seemed calm and collected on videos. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't throwing tantrums. He wasn't calling people names. He wasn't doing anything. Like, he was just very quiet always. He seemed like a nice guy. But I just got so lucky because he not only kind of instilled his passion for the game, which is very pure in me. Like, he is motivated by the right things. He's not motivated by, this is a fast way to make money. He understands it's a difficult game and he loves it, and he loves what it teaches him. He loves kind of the process. So there's that element, but he also was just such a wonderful model of, yes, this kind of emotional stability, of this ability to just remain calm and to just make good decisions and still be such a good person, right? I had no idea that he, that he has so many interests outside of poker. I had no idea what he does and all of the ways that he kind of makes life better for other people. That was just not something I could have known. I had no idea that he loves theater and he loves restaurants and he loves music and he loves to support all of these different ventures. And so I think I was very lucky that I had him by my side, and him kind of whispering in my ear. One of the things he told me very early on. So when you were saying that there's there's a cost to hand analysis where you're defending what you did. He actually made it very clear that I never had to be defensive, that mistakes are how you learn, that playing badly is how you learn, and that he doesn't care if I make a mistake. He cares that I have a reason for it. He cares about the fact that I'm actually thinking through things, because you can figure out the strategy eventually. Here you really shouldn't be doing things like this because of X or Y. But if I'm thinking, that's the most important thing. And he also told me something very early on that became a guiding principle. And I think it's kind of one of the things that's one of his guiding principles that makes him so good, which was a very short phrase: less certainty, more inquiry. And it was just so powerful. I was like, my jaw dropped open. And it's so funny because Erik has told me over and over, he's like, oh, I'm not a very eloquent person. I'm like, dude, you're so eloquent. You have all of these, you need someone like me following you around and actually noting them down, because it was so beautifully put. And he was referring to a very good player, I won't say who'd been talking through a hand and like saying that this is what you do, and this is what you do, and this is what you do here. And Erik just said, less certainty, more inquiry. You can't be certain ever. There's no right way to play a hand. How do you know something's a mistake? You need to go through the entire process. You need to constantly inquire, be curious, be willing to change, be willing to grow, be willing to change your mind. And the fact that I had those words in my head, and that I had his model of just calm demeanor and all of these things, I think really helped set me up for a much more positive and healthy relationship with poker.
Yeah, I love that. I love that phrase. That
so great.
Yeah.
I just want to paste it, on my wall. Less certainty, more inquiry, because it applies to everything. And we just love certainty, and we want to be certain, and we want to be right. And that's just, that open-mindedness is such a valuable attitude in life.
With Erik, there's a movement in the game towards analytical methods, computing power. The movement is very far advanced now, and we have solutions to certain idealized poker problems. And it certainly seems like poker is moving towards being, if not solved, good approximate solutions for lots of tough poker problems. And so Erik, what's interesting is he's in an environment where the game is increasingly moved towards that type of play, analytical methods, computing power, all that. But it's never going to be entirely that, because there are other aspects to the game. So for instance, I want to talk about your chapter on hand reading and body language and this sort of thing, because like in a particular problem, assume it's 5 years from now and the game is solved, right? The nature of the solution will be that in this situation, your bluffing frequency is X. Mm-hmm. Well, you still have to execute the bluff, and people have to not be able to tell the difference between the times you're bluffing and not. And so Erik, there will be the reason it's always important to have less certainty and more inquiry is you could listen to someone who has a very cogent explanation of a hand based purely on the game theoretic example, but Erik, in his experience, has also played with people that maybe are the best readers of body language in the game. Yes. And so he might listen to them explain a hand, very similar hand, where they have an entirely different way of breaking it down that's also very smart, and they have an entirely different game plan. And so for Erik, it's all about synthesizing all of those approaches.
Yeah.
So not being like absolutely sure that this is the answer. All right, take us to the chapter where you make a full-on study of body language. What did you learn there? Because I wrote down the guy's name. I wasn't familiar, but he does video analysis breakdowns, and he's probably going to be overbooked after this book
Blake
comes
Eastman. Yeah. So there were two people who I consulted about this. So Blake Eastman is the one you're referring to, and he's just undertaken this really cool project over the last few years, where he has players play at RFID tables, so you can see their cards, and he has a setup. These are special tables where he's taping everything, and then he has both computers analyzing it, and then he has independent coders and people looking at these hundreds of hours of footage, looking at things, because he comes from the perspective, and which I fully agree with, because I think as a psychologist, this is how you do good experimental studies. And my last book was about con artists, where I learned that it's very hard to tell when people are lying, especially if they're good at it. And you certainly can't see it in their face. Con artists don't even have, the thing that's been so popularized in the last decade or so, micro expressions. People say, oh, they're just these fleeting expressions. Well, those come from cognitive load. Those come from, there being some sort of conflict. You don't actually know if it means that the person's lying or if they're stressed or any of these things. However, in good con artists, it's just totally absent because they live the lie. And it's the same of good bluffers, good poker players. They're not stressed. As you said earlier, they're not stressed when they're bluffing. So I knew all of that. But if you want data that actually makes sense on behaviors, you need a lot of iterations. You need a lot of observation. You need to be able to discern the signal from the noise. And otherwise, there's just too much noise. And you can't tell, this guy did that. Well, if I've only seen him do it once, that's not a large enough number. That's not a large enough sample. I need to do it over and over and over and observe. And if it keeps being predictive, okay, then maybe there's something there. So what Blake has done is actually look at all sorts of different players to try to see in aggregate, are there things that are generally predictive? Are there moments in time when people are less guarded? Are there certain moments in a hand where you should really be looking? Which parts of the body are generally most predictive? And he did an analysis of me. He actually looked at videos of me playing and helped me see that, I had tells that I didn't realize that I had, which is I think it's a really wonderful thing to have someone show you. Yeah. It's so easy to be defensive when someone's pointing out problems and say, no, I was just tired, I don't normally do that. But when you kind of, and I had that reaction a few times. He's like, you did this. I'm like, but, okay, no, but I actually have to listen to what he's saying. And I talk through a lot of it in the book in the interest of journalism and in the interest of transparency. But that was really interesting, working with him and kind of seeing what he does and how he approaches tells, because it's very different from like saying something like, oh, when someone looks up, it means they're bluffing. When someone looks left, it means this. Someone looks right. No, he is all about looking at behaviors over time and figuring out kind of what's predictive for this individual. And that, I think, is a much better way of looking at it. But then I actually also talked to a psychologist, Michael Slepian, who did an analysis. He did some psych studies on poker players where he took videos of World Series of Poker main event players, and he had naive subjects who didn't know anything about poker, and then he repeated it with people who did know stuff about poker. It didn't really matter. He had them look at different elements of the coverage and ask them a simple question. Does this person have a strong hand or not? Is this person strong? What are they doing? And he had three conditions. In one, he just showed unfiltered video. Obviously, no one could see the cards, right? That information wasn't there, but you saw everything. Just from the waist up, the way that you normally see a show, the way you'd normally see poker on TV. In another one, he had people just look at shoulders up, just look at the face. And that's what people normally do. You, Brandon, you play at very high levels. You've got a lot of starers at the high rollers, people who just try to stare you down and figure out, what's going on. I've played with some of those guys, and some of them can be very scary. They don't stop staring at you. That happens actually more. I think there are more of the high roller players who have very scary stares than people at my
who's
level.
got the most scary stare?
Well, it's so funny because I know all these people and I know they're not scary in real life, but I think, someone like Stevie has a pretty scary and intimidating stare, which is very funny because he's the nicest guy. But Stevie is Stephen Chidwick. He has a very intense stare. Alex Foxen has a very intense stare. And I know both of these people in real life, and they're not like that normally, but they definitely do stare you down to a very large extent. What about you? Who do you think has the scariest stare?
I've never given it much thought. The scariest stare.
I've never paid, so I don't know Tom Dwan, and I've never played with him, but in some of the videos, he seems to have some pretty intense stares too.
No, most of the time he just looks at a point on the table. He doesn't generally look at a person. No one really comes to mind.
All right, so it's just me. But anyway, so back to this study. So people just looked at faces, and then in a third condition, they actually just looked at below the shoulders, so at the arms and the hands. And he found that when you looked at the whole video, you were basically at chance, 50-50, whether you were right or wrong, that the person had a strong hand or was bluffing. And that's normal. So 50-50 is actually how we usually are at spotting deception. Normally, it's a coin flip, even for people who think they're very good at it. That's kind of generally we're about 50-50. When people looked at the face only, they became much worse. Their performance went down. So the face wasn't just predictive, it actually was harmful. And there are some other studies that I read about where people who looked at faces in poker actually made worse decisions because they were looking at, and this isn't Slepian's work anymore, but they were looking at things like trustworthiness, and it screwed up with their thought process, and they actually made worse decisions when they looked at people's faces and how they looked, which was really interesting. I don't actually remember if I put that in the book or not, but it's really cool work.
It was a great chapter.
Thank you. And then the people who just looked at the hands, they did the best. They actually performed well above chance. So they knew, even if they knew nothing about poker, just by looking at the hands, at how people handled chips and cards, they were able to tell if someone had a strong hand better than chance. And that was just so cool. And he replicated this many times. And then there's some unpublished stuff that he's been doing where he had people, rate smoothness of gestures, etc. And it's so cool because normally, how many poker players do you know who stare at people's hands? And are hands really the thing that you're controlling the most? Probably not. You're supposed to keep a poker face, but you're probably not nearly as aware of your hand gestures. And it's funny, when I was writing this chapter and writing all this stuff, part of me was saying this is really interesting, and another part was saying, shit, now other people are going to know this too. And so they'll probably control their own behavior. But the thing about hands is that they're actually much more difficult to control. It's much more difficult to control your exact motions than it is to control your face muscles because we're not used to doing it. So learning things like that was just really interesting because it's a totally different way of figuring out what behavior means, what tells look like, because you're not going from your intuition, oh, this is what a liar looks like. You're actually going from data. You're actually going from, which body part, if you just show it to random people, predicted whether or not they could tell that the hand was strong or weak. And that's really cool. I don't think anyone would have necessarily predicted the results of that study in advance, especially poker players.
It accords with my own experience. My view on tells is that you're really, what you would love to know is what's going on inside the body in terms of adrenal reaction, in terms of cortisol, heartbeat. That's what you would really love to know. So what I'm doing is really looking for credible signals about what's going on to adrenal levels. And there aren't always situations where it corresponds exactly adrenal levels, strength and weakness, but there are some situations where it does. So one clear example where it does is if they are surprised that they've hit a big hand at a big moment, the adrenaline's always going to go up at that time. Like, you know, you have 7-7 in your hand and it's a big pot. I re-raised you, you call, and the flop comes king 7-7. Everyone's going to get real excited, and it's going to be hard for you to control your adrenaline if it's a very important spot. So if I'm playing against you, it's which signals credibly represent high adrenal, high cortisol levels in the body, and hands are very good there.
Yes.
So if you're looking at a beginning poker player, often, like if they go to re-raise you and the hands are a little shaky, that means like aces or kings. Like it's just so much adrenaline, they can't help. The hands are a little shaky when they're putting out the chips. Like that's just.
Oh, that happened to me when I was just starting out, for sure.
Yeah,
that
that's
was like,
just a classic.
Hands, stop shaking.
That's a classic tell, and I've always personally not been a chip shuffler because I've always believed that's a hard thing to meld with minimal tells. Like, why would you be engaged in the chip shuffling and playing around?
I'm completely with you for two reasons. One, it gives a lot of information away, and two, chips are dirty. Touch them as infrequently as humanly possible. Please continue.
And I also I have a habit which most players find annoying, which is I actually keep my hands still and I cover the cards. And it's more of like a trembling hand, perfect equilibrium. Like if someone's marking the cards or something, they can't see the cards. So I have like one edge out, but otherwise like they can't see the cards. And that's just a habit that I've picked up over time. But
smart.
But I think that I think ideally what you're looking for is credible signals of adrenaline, and it makes sense to me that hands are a one. But for some, obviously in the high rollers, the scarves and stuff have become popular because having the neck vein go off is another one. All sorts of pulse things.
Absolutely. But I have to say, you also have to figure out, what does adrenaline mean for this person? Does this person get really, especially at the high, when is the adrenaline kicking in? Is it when they have a strong hand, or is it when they're bluffing? Is it when they really want to get called, or they really don't want to get called? Because it can actually go both ways. And I think it can be different from player to player. So I think that's the second part of the equation that you need to answer if you haven't played with this person before. So I think that that's also really important. Do you find that as well, or do you think that that's not?
Yeah, definitely. One difference between the shot clock tournaments and say big cash games or the old days when you didn't have the shot clock is that you've seen a lot of hands, like say in high stakes poker and so forth, where they wait it out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's disappeared with the shot clock, because if you're talking about a 30-second or a 60-second, maybe you have a couple of extensions, but it's basically a pretty quick decision. It's not enough time. But the tell rationale for waiting it out, if it's say a huge cash game decision, is that a lot of players it can be difficult to tell in the first 60 seconds whether they're bluffing or value.
Mm-hmm.
But if you wait it out for like 5 minutes, they become calmer if they have value, and they become more stressed if they're bluffing. So that's like the rationale in a cash game for waiting it out.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
In a tournament, I mean, you can still possibly get that effect, but it's 30, 60 seconds. It's not enough time.
Sure.
And you can get some confusing signals. So is there anyone that you're continuing to work with there, or I'm sure it's quite expensive, so it's probably like a one-time project. I'm sure Erik asked you for some advice, like who are you sending people to in terms of if they want to spend $1,000 or so and learn about?
No, I actually think Blake is a great person to go to. I was going to when we had just. This was back in January. he'd relocated to Vegas and had like this whole setup going there. So I was going to go and do another analysis at his actual special tables because I hadn't done that. He'd only ever watched televised footage of me playing. And unfortunately, COVID struck and we haven't been able to do that, but I'd love to, because I think it's so valuable. We are I think everyone, it's so difficult to not be kind of hubristic about your own abilities and to say, oh, well, I don't really need this. I don't give off tells. Like, I'm very good at doing this. I'm very good at doing that. But I think you just, coaching is always good. Like, I didn't think I needed a mental coach. I ended up working with Jared Tendler, who's a mental coach. There's so many things that you don't really think you need, but then they're so helpful when you use them, because you can always improve and there are always things to work on. And it's always just good to get an external perspective. So yeah, I think that reading some of this literature and just figuring out, how do you go about analyzing these sorts of situations? How do you go about, what's a good strategy for thinking about this? And when do you not want to do it? When is it actually probably counterproductive? And one other thing, by the way, that I've learned in working with Blake is never try to do fake tells. I mean, it just, not only does it not work, but it just screws you up. Try to keep things simple. A lot of people try to do fake reverse tells. And usually it's very easy to see through that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you read some of the old books by Joe Navarro? He had some.
Oh, I did. I've read some of the Navarro stuff. I have, Mike Caro's Book of Tells. I've read all of that, and oh my God, that book with its photographs.
Oh, Joe, yeah. It was funny. One time I was playing in a cash game, and there was a big pot, and a friend of mine who's pretty funny. He all of a sudden he looked under the table, and he was looking under the table for an extended period. And this was a good-natured group, and everyone was like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I just read this book by Joe Navarro. He told me that I've got to look at their feet because if they're bluffing, their feet are moving like they're going to run away." And it was really funny.
That's really funny. Well, it's so funny because some of that stuff, some of the Navarro stuff, some of Mike Caro stuff does hold up. In a general sense, because, the whole, weak means strong, strong means weak. That's very basic, but that actually holds up sometimes. I had an experience that I write about in the book where I was playing against this guy who'd just been like bluffing me. He's this older Russian, and I hadn't had very positive experiences with them.
Was this in Monaco?
This was in Monte Carlo. Yeah. And we're on the river, he's all in, and I'm trying to figure out whether to call or not. And, I have top pair, but, this is a big hand, and he's been bluffing me just all day relentlessly. And like I said, he's an older Russian man, and they love to bluff me. They don't like, they love to take advantage of girls at the table. And so I'm sitting here and I'm like, oh my God, I guess I have to call. And then he stands up and starts like doing a little dance. and like, oh my God, that's like tells 101. Like, this guy is not bluffing. And I ended up calling because he also called the clock on me, which really screwed me up. It was the first time someone had ever called the clock on me. And of course he had a monster. And I lost a lot of chips. But it was just so funny. I mean, you don't have to be an expert in tells to see that this guy standing up and literally doing a little jig behind his chair at the table probably isn't bluffing. But somehow I just out-leveled myself and decided I had to call.
Yeah, I can remember one famous hand where that happened in the main event. Someone did it, and someone with kings almost folded. But as you said, it is somewhat reliable, but you can't necessarily read into it 100%. Now, did you come across any body language savants in the poker world? Any people that you thought were especially talented at reading body language?
I think some of the best players are very good at it. I think Erik is actually very good at it. And he doesn't want you to know it necessarily. But he's very good because he's so attentive and he has so much experience. I mean, few people have as much experience in tournament poker as Erik does. He's been playing at the highest level since the 80s and constantly, right? It's not like he took a few years off here and there. If you look at his Hendon mob, it's insane. He's got final tables, in every single year and first place finishes and all of these things. So he's very good. Someone else who was very good, who is just such a fun guy, such an interesting character, is Lucky Chewy, Andrew Lichtenberger, who's also incredibly attentive. He's just someone who is, so in the zone, so zen, and just and he calls it in the flow of the game. It's so funny to hear him talk about it. He's talking about the flow of energy between players and all of this stuff. And he's right. He's very good at spotting it, and then he stays out of trouble. It's so fun to watch him play because he can seem so passive, and then all of a sudden he just strikes. And that doesn't mean he has a monster hand. He just figured out when to make a perfectly timed move. And so he's very good. And then I think there are some other players who you wouldn't necessarily think of, but who are very good. Like I said, I've become quite friendly with Alex Foxen, and we have played together sometimes. And he's very good at picking up on tells. And we've talked about players, afterwards, and he will say things like, did you notice that, whenever he re-raised with weak hands, he did this, and whenever he did it with strong hands, he did that. So he's very good at picking up on things like that. I think that's probably one of the reasons he's become such a formidable tournament player in the last few years. It is
fun when you come across someone that is special at making reads. I've found it remarkable. There are actually very few people that are exceptional in the high levels of play, because the experience base is what it is. The general level is very high, the general ability to pick up on things. But there are very few people that I would view as especially talented.
I've heard that Phil Ivey is very good at it, but I've never played with him, so I don't have any personal experience of that.
I have played with him a good bit. I haven't necessarily seen enough to put him. I would put Daniel in the category before I would put Phil in the category, because Daniel is very talented at reading people. And it's sort of not a popular answer because it's well known. Back in the ESPN days, they would just sort of sample the ones that he got right and stuff like that. Sure. But he is genuinely talented. And Kenny Tran, who used to play a lot of big games, I would say he's the closest I've seen to a full-on savant. Patrick's pretty good.
Patrick is very good. I love Patrick. Can I give a big shout out to Patrick? Patrick is wonderful.
Oh yeah, you have to send him a book because he's in the book. You have to.
He is in the book. Hi Patrick, you're in the book. I forgot to send you a book.
Yeah, you need to
You've become part of my poker vocabulary. Erik and I use you as a catchphrase.
Oh, what would Patrick do?
No, Patrick mode.
Oh, Patrick mode. Which is like focused or what?
No, which is going crazy on the bubble.
Oh, nice.
Which is abusing people on the bubble.
Okay, so
because nobody wants to bubble. Something that Patrick taught me.
Yeah, especially in the main event and important stuff. Yeah. The main event is the most important bubble period because so many people got in through satellites and more importantly, so many people are reporting home about what's happening and they're reporting to all their friends, and it's definitely the number one bubble tournament. So I really only have one more question. We've gone over a lot of time. it's interesting that your previous book, Confidence Game, studied con artists. How did you get into that?
The honest answer?
Yeah.
Is that I watched David Mamet's House of Games, which is a great movie that I highly recommend. And I mean, David Mamet is obsessed with con artists. He has so many movies about cons, but this particular one, I'd never seen it before. And it featured this female protagonist who was a psychologist who had just written this best-selling book. And she was actually a clinical psychologist, so someone who sees patients and who should really understand human nature. And she winds up at the center of this huge con. And kind of the twist is she thinks she's in on it. She thinks that she's learning about this world, and really she's the target. I won't ruin it for people who've never seen the movie, but if you know David Mamet's work, I mean, it doesn't end well. This is not a happy ending. Everyone gets to go home with everything type of movie. And when I saw it, I was really intrigued. I thought, wow, this is not the type of person you normally see as a victim of a con artist. Normally, not just in fictional depictions, but just in general in news stories and all of these things, you see people and you see the victims as kind of sometimes even denigrated a little bit, oh, you can't fool an honest man. Oh, they're so gullible, so greedy, so stupid, all of these negative things. And you don't normally see kind of this very accomplished, smart person who falls for a con. And I was very intrigued, and I hopped on the computer after finishing that movie and thought, I want to read a little bit more about this. How often do smart people become the victims of con artists? How does this actually happen? And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't actually find what I wanted to read. And so I went down a 3-year rabbit hole that became The Confidence Game.
Very nice. Very nice. And unfortunately, you predated Madoff, right?
No, I actually, so I have a few sentences about Madoff. It was going on at the same time, but I made a conscious choice to write about cons that were less covered in the media, that people didn't really know about, to try to do some more original reporting. And there was just so much going on. There were books about Madoff. So I think he's in one sentence, but I actually, when it comes to Ponzi schemes, I wrote about some of the original Ponzi schemes that even predated Ponzi.
So I guess my question, one thing I'm interested in is with there's a bit of a poker world and that world, because the poker world, the places that you're going to, Vegas, LA, and the crowd, it's a very hustle heavy crowd. If not directly involving confidence men, it's a hustle heavy world.
Yes.
And so when I reflect on my long experience in poker, one thing that I often try to sort out is having the long experience of observing. And I'm one to really like sit back and observe. I don't really get it. I'm like Erik in that regard. I'm like a sit back and watch and not and play it very carefully. But you learn, and what you learn is very good defensive skills. Like you do develop a hustle radar that is quite good. But one thing I often wonder about is what are the costs and benefits of the hustle radar? Because on the one hand, you learn like a certain set of defensive skills that serve you well because you're playing defense against these hustles, which let's be honest, the whole society is moving towards that world.
Yep.
Like if you don't have a good hustle radar, you're in trouble because the whole world, unfortunately, moves in that direction, which is quite scary. Yeah. And social media, of course, plays into it. But So there's a benefit to developing a hustle radar, as no doubt you did with writing these books and playing all these things. But there's also a cost, because you lose some of that childish, like, let's do it, let's go.
Yep.
And I wonder what you have to say, or what you've learned about the cost. You lose a certain, like, when you show up as a freshman in college, you're like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go. Like, it doesn't matter what the idea is, that sort of style. And it's frankly more fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I went through this period when I finished writing The Confidence Game. So I'd spent multiple years doing research and spending time with con artists with their victims. And it was quite depressing, actually, on a lot of levels. I tried to make the book not depressing. But it weighs on you when you see these people who've ruined lives, and when you see the lives that have been ruined. And I just emerged from it thinking, oh my God, I can't trust anyone. Just lock the door, throw away the key. And I had to get over it, because I realized that that's a horrible way to live, because that just saps you of kind of one of the most essential things of what it means to be human. It saps you of kind of hope and optimism and all of these good things. That's what con artists take advantage of. They take advantage of the fact that we're hopeful people, that we want, a better world. They take advantage of our good impulses, not our bad impulses. Sometimes the bad impulses, but in general of the good impulses that we have. And so shutting yourself off to all of that means shutting that off in yourself. And that's a horrible cost. And, Ricky Jay said this very eloquently, so I want to misquote him because I don't remember the exact words. He gave an interview to the New York Times at one point, and he said something along the lines of, I wouldn't want to live in a world where I couldn't be conned, because that would be a world where you couldn't believe in anyone or anything. And I think that just sums it up, and it's so powerful and it's so true. I don't want to live in that world either, because I want to live in a world where you can believe in things, where you can forge connections, where you can be hopeful and optimistic, and hope for a better world and hope for a better existence. And I think you do need to have a good radar. So what I've tried to do is just use the journalistic mantra and apply it to everything. Trust but verify. Your initial reaction shouldn't be, I distrust everyone. It should be trust, but then verify. Always verify, and really verify. Be aware of your biases. Be aware that you have confirmation biases, that you're going to look for evidence that you're right rather than evidence that you're wrong. Be aware of selection effects. Be aware of all of that. And so try to verify in as objective a fashion as you can. It's hard. It's much easier said than done. But to me, that's the best way forward. Stay open, stay curious, stay hopeful and excited. But whenever you're about to make a big decision, or whenever you're kind of entering into a new relationship with a person, be it, romantic or not, or business or a friendship, just do your homework and ask questions that you might not want to ask, because at the end of the day, the costs of being wrong are quite high.
It seems like very wise advice. Well, with that, I will tell everyone to go out and buy The Biggest Bluff, which comes out on June 22nd. Is that right?
23rd.
23rd. Okay. June 23rd. Yes. And hopefully this pod will come out before then, but we will see.
All right.
And I am deeply appreciative of the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Okay. I'll see you soon.